Before the sermon or reading, this is an excerpt from The Dharma of Snow by Aya Medhanandi Bhikkhuni, who lives in Perth, Ontario. That is important to remember. We're talking about snow. This piece was published in 2016 in Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. In its entirety, it's a reflection on how this one moment is a metaphor for the Noble Eightfold Path, but I am only using an illustration of it for the purpose of this service. She writes, "Last winter, we had quite a lot of snow. In April, we were still navigating from building to building through narrow pathways dug through snow several feet high. The days were quite bright and sunny, and it was remarkable to us that the snow was still there. One day after our winter retreat, we were moving a very heavy carpet from one building to another, which none of us could lift. We managed to get it on a sled and pulled it from the main house to the meditation hall. And then by that very afternoon, the snow was completely gone. We couldn't understand how that had happened, literally from morning to afternoon. One of the nuns at the Hermitage, Sister Ahimsa, wrote about it to her son, who was a geophysicist. This is what he wrote back. You seem very impressed with how the snow melted. I'm sure it was amazing to see. The world transformed overnight. Melting is a non-linear process, which means melting begets melting. Also, snow requires a lot of energy to change from ice to water, and this energy does not cause any change in temperature. What this means is that the snow can actually be above freezing without melting. If all the snow gets really warm over a few nice days, then it can melt all at once, really fast. As the melted snow starts to run through the unmelted snow, it helps to speed up the process. Then, when the ground appears, it absorbs much more sunlight and the melting really speeds up. The melting has probably been happening for weeks unseen, and then the snow layer collapsed all at once. This sort of regime shifting happens all the time in the earth sciences. Things hold on to the way they are, even in very unfavorable conditions. And then at some invisible point, something snaps and everything changes. I hope you all are buckled in. This is a big one. The early 2000s was a turning point in American retail, a tale of three businesses once likely believed too big to fail. Blockbuster was the first, the chain of stores people would visit to rent movies and later video games and other entertainment. They were a huge retailer at their peak in 2004 with over 9,000 stores around the world. By 2010, the company was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Blockbuster actually failed to have sufficient funds to make the requisite payments to stay in business, and the only thing that kept them from liquidating completely was being bought out by another company, Dish Network. By 2014, only 51 stores remained open, all of them in the US. The next one is Borders, one of the former bookstore giants. Their business strategy was to have stores with thousands of titles available on site. They were beautiful stores. Borders developed tools to predict reading trends. As e-business was taking off, like streaming services with Blockbuster, their leadership hunkered down. They invested in expanding into CDs and DVD sales. Bless them, they ended up selling their online business to Amazon, favoring a model that focused on their stores. They filed for bankruptcy in 2011, although the last year they turned a profit was 2006. And lastly, Eastman Kodak, the picture people. In business for more than 100 years, a huge film and camera manufacturer who also invested significantly in research and development. Unlike Blockbuster and Borders, Kodak did move into newer technologies with digital photography and printing. Kodak actually developed the first self-contained digital camera, but struggled to keep up with the industry, which grew quickly. Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012, but was able to reemerge after restructuring and leaving several of their businesses. We want to make the argument that these companies were adversely affected by the Great Recession, and that argument can be made. But more importantly, they were adversely affected by their need to be self-serving and insular. They looked at the changing landscape and thought, surely we will make it, as if we can will things to be true just by believing them. But they held on to the way things were, even in unfavorable conditions. Faced with rapid changing in technology, those businesses mostly chose to rely on what had worked in the past. Their business models had served for a few decades. Physical stores, distribution centers, labs, and plants, and all had costs. They needed to be maintained and to continue to offer quick levels of service, which were becoming more obsolete by the day as people learned they could use their internet access and online businesses and get what they wanted in a timely fashion with the bonus of not having to leave their couch. There were failures of leadership too, failures to be visionary, failures to be an accurate pulse of the changing world, failures to dream. Possible failures to listen to those who advocated for more dramatic change. And wanting to spare thousands of people from pink slips, we'll go with that story, that's what they were going for. Perhaps they only delayed them by maybe a year or two and left them unprepared for industries that had moved so far beyond where they had been left that they may not have been able to catch up. Most importantly, those businesses lost sight of their purpose. They focused on the bottom line instead of the horizon. Any organization or institution whose vision collapses to 1 to 2 years or even quarters is at risk of losing sight of itself and the bigger picture. They focused on their products and their buildings and not their passions. They were too big and not mission-driven. There's a saying that if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. A different tale than Blockbuster, Borders, and Kodak is that of the Zenith Drilling Company. The story goes that Zenith had been an industry leader in drill bit manufacturing, revolutionizing the industry once upon a time. But you know when you're doing something well and others want to follow, and so their competition was catching up, eating away at their market share. Their board brought in a new CEO who had all the company's leadership come to a conference, and he asked them to clarify their mission. After several days of intense discussion and undoubtedly debate, they came back. Their mission was to make the best drill bits in the world. Everyone agreed that this was an excellent mission. The new CEO, though, was unimpressed. No, he said. Your mission isn't to make the best drill bits in the world. It's to make the best holes in the world. That simple shift in perspective changed their company. They continued to make great drill bits, but they also expanded their hole-making business, innovating laser drilling tools and brought them back to being number one in their industry. There are probably as many reasons not to look at businesses to help us understand what works for churches as there are that do. But the idea of focusing on purpose, mission, and strength is absolutely one place where it is helpful. We talk a lot about wanting our congregations to grow, and most of the time this seems very much like people want it to grow for the sake of growing, to meet what you have identified as needs. We want to grow to have more income or share the workload. Growing for the sake of growing, to quote someone likely lost to the annals of the internet, is the growth strategy of cancer cells. It is also generally the mission of most businesses as a way to improve their bottom line. Tell me, do you know anyone who has ever joined a church to spend their time, talent, and treasure doing something someone decided some time ago was how church should be run? The thing is that this approach doesn't work for churches because we don't have that bottom line. I mean, we do, but we don't. Our bottom line is not about making money. Ours is about serving each other, the world, and the holy, however we define that. Ours is an organization devoted to service that can only be given from ourselves. Capitalism has deeply impacted churches, not surprising when generations have been fed on the diet that capitalism is everything. But when we allow capitalism to influence our churches, we are rendering what we have to empire instead of to the sacred, that which is greater than we are. And we treat each other in a way that reflects the belief that people are expendable and no one needs to be held accountable for their actions if their goal is the bottom line. That relationships are transactional. This is not how congregations work, let alone thrive, and certainly not ours as Unitarian Universalists. There are different kinds of growth that congregations may experience. Numerical growth is just one, and unless a congregation learns to live within its means, it is often the one most sought after, like a magic potion that will fix their problems. In all honesty, it is not that. As membership increases, so do the demands of supporting a larger congregation. If a congregation cannot live within its means at 70 members, it will not be able to do so any better at 150 or 500. Everything congregations have either comes from their members or comes from the way its members can fundraise from the community, at least in our UU congregations. And this is how it should be. Giving is an act of mutual care and support, a way of affirming community. Capitalism may be terrible, but until we find another option, we still do need money to function. We need money to run our air conditioning, to pay staff, and especially to serve our mission. Churches and their congregations are an expression of what you love and value. Not the minister, not the UUA, but you. At General Assembly last year, when the number of active congregations was listed, I realized that we have lost a small percentage of our congregations in the last decade. Before that General Assembly, a colleague asked me if I thought that we'd still have any but our large congregations in 2050. The answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that congregations have perhaps always struggled with volunteerism and engagement. When I was an intern, and I know this is surprising, but when I was an intern, I read through correspondence and various reports and notes in the archives at Meadville Lombard about my teaching congregation. And the same challenges that we have now, they faced even in the 1920s through the 1960s. Only they did it with larger congregations, and we've all been enduring a pandemic and an endemic for the last 4+ years now, not to mention all the other challenges of a failing empire and a world on fire. I also do know that what worked before, that is pre-2020, doesn't work anymore. We already knew that what worked in 1970 didn't work anymore, but everything has changed since the pandemic started. Well, it accelerated the changes that were already happening, just like the snow suddenly collapsing one afternoon, apparently without warning. There have been warnings about changing dynamics that have impacted the church, but not everyone has been willing to listen. I also do know that church attendance is dropping in a society that has not valued it for generations. Other activities and events happen Sunday mornings, a time that used to be set aside for church. I have been invited to speak at events in communities that were happening on Sunday mornings, which leads to an awkward conversation about how they know I'm a minister, but seem to think that I'll be available then. Attendance is even stagnating and dropping in evangelical churches, pretty much the only ones that were growing before the pandemic. And families, of course, now have sports and music and other practices and competitions that ask their time. We won't mention the scandals that churches have experienced over the years of clergy and leader abuse, or that if children are even raised in the church, they lost interest in it, seeing people who didn't look like them preaching a theology that they didn't resonate with, or as part of a congregation that wasn't healthy. And I know that millennials and Gen Z not only have all of this as their lived experiences, but also a higher likelihood that they are working in more than one job to make ends meet. They're also less interested in the whole church aesthetic of showing up on Sunday mornings in a self-serving practice to be patted on the back before returning to their daily lives. These folks want to know how we're showing up in the community, not giving money, although there is a place for that for sure, but what are we doing to make a difference in the world? As people who don't have much disposable income, the idea that what we do matters is even more important for these folks. Some leaders in our faith rightly argue that we will not grow our congregations if we are not seeking to spread the good news of Unitarian Universalism. In general, we UUs are pretty bad at this, having witnessed the harm sometimes done by evangelicals and other loud voices and other faiths, and so we stay away from the practice. But we have a saving message. People want to know that there are religious people who think that they're holy just as they are, as their full selves. That we know the world fails so many and that we are trying not to do that. Our congregations are also currently being met with the challenge that there aren't as many ministers going into parish ministry. About the same number of people are going into ministry, but they don't anticipate serving a congregation. Some don't see a future in it because they've seen their own and other churches continuing to do the same things they've always done, and it's not working. Some don't see a future in it because they dream bigger than our congregations are willing to dream. Some don't see a future in it because the congregations they've known have been toxic. So we've settled the fact that there are a lot of problems with congregations right now, right? So what can be done? If you feel uncomfortable, you have reached the doorstop of opportunity, says Jill Novensky, the Director of Religious Education for Children and Youth at the Community Church of New York. With their senior minister, the Reverend Peggy Clark, they have begun a movement called Disrupt Church. There's a Facebook group where conversations are beginning, and there was a great workshop that was presented at last year's General Assembly. Some thoughts that I had. First is that you have to want to change. Not say that you want to change, but actually want to change. Transform even. Not we can will it to happen just by thinking it. The kind of change that says we want more children and youth, and we are willing to do what needs to be done to have them here. Money, resources, presence, engagement with a community, meal trains for families, whatever it takes. Not, we like having them here, but I'm not going to miss a service for them. Second is figure out who you are and what you want. Are you going to stick with making the best drill bits in the world, or are you going to make the best holes in the world? Is growth an expression of a vibrant faith or a way to try to make ends meet? Are you excited about people for who they are or what they bring? I can assure you that the visitors know. Third is that you have to be open to ideas. When I have to make major changes in my life, like when I realized I needed to leave the hospital system where I was previously employed, my strategy was throw everything on the table. Chaplaincy is work, or chaplaincy training to become an educator, parish ministry, retail, nonprofit work, going back to school. Find what matches what you value and matches the purpose of the church. Are you looking for meaning, connection, service? Imagine what different shapes that might take. Fourth, and I feel like you already know this, but it is worth saying, this isn't the minister's work, and we can't save you. This is your work. Ministers can and should lead and support you, guide you, encourage you, challenge you, but we cannot do your work, even if we wanted to. Ministers come and go. Even those who have ministries of 40 years or more in one location will eventually leave. Congregants too, but churches remain. They can remain far longer than any one of us. This isn't to be taken lightly, as churches do close too. But we know churches last for a long time. The slogan for this era could be, "The church is dead, long live the church." Much like the Princess Bride's Dread Pirate Roberts, the church is an institution. The Dread Pirate was handed to new leader after new leader as ministry can be handed from minister to minister, and the crew handed over and over again as the congregation is handed from person to person, generation to generation. The institution remains. 5, you have to do the work. People aren't interested in coming to church, although this changes from time to time, like after the 2016 election. They're interested in seeing how we're being the church. We have to keep working on lessening the doing and increasing the being. We want to let go of some of the meetings and committees and all the things that sometimes become their own purpose and not used as a tool to serve the mission of the church. What might some of this new church look like? What if we leaned into strengths and interests better? I read an NPR article about a pastor who left his church because he was tired of the same thing every week. He worked for 30 years as a pastor, but the way that we do church, the sermons and the services, asking for money, the routine and formality of it, I am not complaining, I want to be clear, wasn't connecting for his people. They were turned off. And so he left to figure out what was next. That turned out to be having a fire pit, leading prayer and reflection on the Gospels, sitting in silence by the fire, and then getting to work in one of the more 50 raised beds on the farm that he created. People came every week for that chance to center, to be together in a meaningful way, and continue connecting while doing the work of growing food that was then given away in the community. They want their time together to be meaningful, not only for themselves, but for everyone. They are thus fed and feed others. One of my friends and colleagues was serving a small congregation in Texas. They decided last year to scrap worship once a month and instead do a direct service project of some kind. Their first project was to create care packages for UU families with trans and non-binary kids that could be mailed out to other fascist states. An extra cool thing about this is that they were able to engage the full congregation, from their smallest children to their eldest elders. Another of our sibling churches recently decided that the struggles of declining membership, increased expenses, and volunteer burnout were too much, and that they would close their 60-member congregation. As their last act of love for their community and Unitarian Universalism, they voted to disperse their $450,000 endowment to organizations they had partnered with in the community, and sent the balance of about $350,000 back to the congregation that had started that one as a satellite. Another non-UU congregation is collecting unsold produce from local vendors and gives it away in their parking lot once a week. Other congregations are offering alternative services, campfire ministries on Friday or Saturday nights, yoga and breathing practices on weeknights, and so on. Some congregations are opening their doors and hosting community dinners once a month, where designated people provide main dishes, both vegetarian and non, and everyone else brings a side, a salad, dessert, beverages, what have you. The meal is followed by a brief participatory worship. One UU congregation's practice has been so popular that they had even higher attendance than they did on Sunday mornings. From the dreaming of the night to the labors of the day, though the path be hard and long, still we strive in expectation. Join we now their ageless song, one with them in aspiration. I don't know that our ancestors would have been able to dream all the ways that the church has changed over the generations, thinking about not only form, but theology, our practices and rituals. That doesn't mean that they aren't faithful expressions. They tell us we are growing, changing, and that what we find now is that even more is yet needed.